I've brought this up in the past, or pretty recently actually, but I've always been a massive fan of the idea of different characters actually growing up together. And that would even include some of the main characters, that being Inosuke, Tanjiro, Zenitsu, and stuff like that. And I've done What If Tanjiro grew up with Zenitsu, but what would have happened if he grew up with Inosuke? And we're going to be talking about that specifically in this What If. So, welcome, this is What If Tanjiro and Inosuke Grew Up Together, and we're going to be starting off of basically two different directions. The first direction would be Tanjiro actually losing his entire family very earlier on, and basically living in the wilderness and eventually coming across the one and only Inosuke. Now, this first pathway would be an interesting one because you would have a Tanjiro and Inosuke basically be brothers, like brothers, because they would grow up in the wilderness and more or less have to survive on their own. We know how beneficial beast breathing was to Inosuke, and the fact is, this version of Tanjiro might actually benefit pretty heavily for this so-called beast breathing, especially learning how to utilize some of the beast breathing forms. Now, beast breathing allows for them to basically have a very high awareness of everything around him, kind of like a sonar of some sorts. And on top of that, he would have his insane sense of smell still, so it would massively benefit Tanjiro. Now, you might be thinking, what age would Tanjiro even stumble across Inosuke if his whole family did, well, kick the bucket earlier on? Well, in my opinion, it would still be a relatively older version of Tanjiro. So this Tanjiro would be a little bit more mature, a little bit more educated, but still would massively benefit from learning from Inosuke. And yes, there's going to be some weird temperament between them in the very beginning, but Inosuke and Tanjiro would end up becoming more or less, like I said, brothers, and would be able to actually feed off each other, and in terms of learning how to actually survive very easily, especially amongst the boars. This would lead to Tanjiro and Inosuke more or less becoming very similar in skill, and more or less just similar in general, but the difference is Tanjiro actually has a ton of benefits in terms of, well, like I've said before, his sense of smell, but also his ability to, well, in the future, utilize sun breathing. Now, we're not going to talk about that too earlier on because there's no real reason to talk about it, but I want to quickly talk about this version of the timeline. And I am going to be skipping over quite a few things because I want to accelerate the process. And also, this isn't necessarily about sticking one for one with the story. It's more about just what are the common occurrences that could or benefit both Inosuke and Tanjiro in this situation. Having Tanjiro there would make Inosuke far bit smarter, so when they go to take on the final selection, the duo brothers of the Boar Brothers, you could even call them, both Tanjiro and Inosuke, would actually slay through the entirety of the forest, and very easily at that, because of his sensory details and so on. And it was actually mildly confirmed that Inosuke was at the final selection, or at least at some point, so maybe they do end up stumbling across it, or maybe him being kind of still intelligent, or Tanjiro being intelligent, lead them in the right direction to actually take on this so-called final selection through maybe some things they've heard in the grapevine or something like that, leading them to the final selection. And like I said, they would obliterate the final selection, and this would be a very easy more or less put down for this entire Demon Slayer idea. And Tanjiro and Inosuke would benefit from the final selection just as much as any other arc, just because both of them working together, they would realize how efficient they are at fighting and how good they are at fighting as a duo. And they're going to continue to fight as a duo for as long as possible. Now, this would be leading us into the mansion arc, because this is when Inosuke would originally show up. You could even make the argument that maybe Tanjiro and Inosuke come across Zenitsu first off, and they actually take on the mansion all three together, and Tanjiro is able to keep Inosuke relatively in check, but this whole mansion is very simplistic for them and very easy. So even if you make some sort of argument that these other arcs would still happen, being that of the kidnapper and him meeting Muzan, Nothing really is that different until you basically approach Mount Natagumo, which would be the family of demons, or taking on the one and only Rui. This is where things shake up quite a bit, because I don't think this version of Tanjiro and Inosuke could actually defeat Rui, just like the version in the regular story, Tanjiro cannot defeat Rui. And maybe he sees the sparks of the flames and just a little bit of that sun breathing, but at the end of the day, they would not be strong enough to defeat Rui. But luckily enough, we still will have Giyu and Shinobu Kocho actually showing up to finish off all of these demons, so they'll be okay. Now, there's a reason why I skipped through quite a bit, because I want to get to the real important stuff, and that would be the training arcs. The training arcs is where things are going to drastically change, because once Tanjiro actually starts getting a grasp on, well, his one and only sun breathing, the addition with beast breathing will help him drastically, and I mean drastically. And there's even an argument to be made that Inosuke in this version is actually a good bit stronger, because having that extra partner to train with you is something that is massively beneficial, and something that we'll talk about in the other version of the timeline that I want to talk about before this video actually ends. Now, I want to briefly talk about how more or less Tanjiro would learn sun breathing slowly but surely, would benefit from the connection that he has with Inosuke, and frankly, it would make their duo as a duo partner, or more or less a fighting duo, a lot easier for some of these fights to come, especially something like facing down Enmu. Now, this doesn't mean they're going to beat Akaza, actually far from it, but there's a chance that Akaza doesn't even show up, because in this version, Tanjiro probably wouldn't even face down Muzan in the first place, and that would kind of just be the reality of it. So Rengoku, ironically enough, would still actually survive even without facing down Akaza or trying to survive via then. Now, with that said, how would they fare against someone like Daki and Gyutaro? Well, I think they would fare pretty well, because we have a stronger Inosuke, but actually potentially a weaker Tanjiro. There's definitely a chance that Tanjiro is weaker at this point, because I do believe he would be stronger at the very end, but at this point he might be slightly weaker. But the duo and the connection that they have as brothers, quote unquote, and their ability to fight as a duo might actually cover up the weakness that Tanjiro necessarily has, or the weaker version of Tanjiro that he currently is. But as we kind of push through the Daki and Gyutaro fights, most likely being able to defeat them just but barely, like literally barely. Like, we don't have a healthy Tengen at all. Sorry it took me so long to get that out. I don't know, I just brain farted there for a second, but we don't have a healthy Tengen at all. Like, this is not one of those that I say, oh, Tengen's actually pretty healthy. No, this Tengen's pretty messed up, and they probably would barely squeak out. But when we're talking about the next training, the recovery, going into the Swordsmith's Village arc, is when Tanjiro begins to take that next leap. And when I mean leap, I mean massive leap. Because in the Daki Gyutaro fights, he 100% would have awakened the Demon Slayer mark, and now he's getting more grasp on sun breathing, and his technique with the sword is actually becoming more refined. This version of Tanjiro is at another level at this point. His ability to use sun breathing is pretty good. He's utilizing beast breathing as a way of more or less benefiting him on different techniques, and on also his basically awareness in battle. And this would continue to climb. And I've said this before, an understanding of another breathing style, in my opinion, benefits the Demon Slayer massively. So this would benefit him all the way through, all the way leading up into the Infinity Castle, but not as much as this other timeline I truly believe would benefit. So let's rewind back in time and stay away from that version of the timeline. Now we're going to do a different version of the timeline and talk about a version where Tanjiro and his family actually come across Inosuke pretty earlier on and adopt him into their family. This would take him away from the wilderness that he was at in the first place, and this version actually could change things drastically. Now, With that said, we have Inosuke being added to the family, and most likely, I wouldn't turn Inosuke into a demon when Muzan would arrive or anything like that. Yes, fanfiction-wise, I think that would be a great idea, but I think Nezuko would still become the demon. All I can see is Tanjiro saying, hey, I'm going to sell charcoal, and Inosuke being competitive would say he's going to go with them because he's going to sell more. So this would lead them to more or less go to town on their own, and well, you know, they would go together on their own, if that makes any sense. But they would go together to town and then come back to see that the whole family is more or less dead. And as sad as that is, that's just the reality of this version. And we would see that Nezuko is just barely alive. This would more or less occur in such a way that everything goes relatively the same, leading to, you know, Giyu actually sending both Nezuko, or, well, I guess all three, I said both, but Nezuko, Tanjiro, and Inosuke to Urokodaki. And this is where things, like I've said before, will change immensely, because having a partner that can train with you will drastically help. We know that, well, we know that Beast Breather, the one and only Inosuke, is actually self-taught. Like, he basically has taught himself via the boars. So the fact that he's going to be actually well trained here and still have most, if not all, the training he self-taught himself, if that makes any sense, initially, then he would basically be a lot stronger in this version, and in turn make Tanjiro a lot stronger in this version, because he would be able to have a training partner outside of Urokodaki who could train with him as much as possible. And we know how competitive Inosuke is, so he's going to want to stay above Tanjiro as much as possible. So Tanjiro is going to learn from Inosuke and also more or less be competitive with Inosuke and be able to transcend the skills and also the power that he was at in the original end of the training session going into the final selection. So going into the final selection, after training with Sabito, Mikomo, and Inosuke, this final selection is even easier than the past timeline that I spoke of. This version has a Tanjiro that, yes, doesn't necessarily have beast breathing, but he may have some attributes of it just from a inherent connection with Inosuke or just learning from Inosuke. But at the end of the day, that doesn't necessarily matter because his physical attributes are so much better because he had a training partner in Inosuke. And on top of that, his ability to use water breathing might even be sharper than normal because, like I said, a training partner. These things truly matter and matter quite a bit. And this honestly is something I've talked about before with the whole Zenitsu training with Tanjiro thing. And the personality of Tanjiro definitely will rub off on Inosuke and massively help him in strategy and also the battles to come. Now, this is where I don't want to spend too much time because after the final selection, we know that that's going to be finished off very easily. And I think Inosuke would make the Swamp Demon look like a complete piece of cake. And of course, this would lead us to the face down with Muzan, which would only make these fights against the two demons that he sends after Tanjiro even easier, because now it's a complete and utter, more or less, advantage to the Demon Slayers. You have Inosuke and Tanjiro, but then you also have Yushiro, you have Nezuko, you have Lere Tamayao, you have all these people, and frankly, all of these people are a far bit stronger, or at least Tanjiro and Inosuke are a far bit stronger than the canon version. And this is where things become vastly, vastly easier. I mean, we're talking about a far stronger Inosuke, a far stronger Tanjiro, and this is earlier on. This is not like, oh, they're like molding into it a little bit and stuff like that. This is a Tanjiro and Inosuke who more or less have gotten the same experience as original Tanjiro, but they've just done it together to a larger extent. So when they meet, when they meet Zenitsu and take on the mansion is an absolute breeze. And I could even make the argument that going into the more or less Mount Natagumo is a breeze as well, at least outside of, well, Rui. Rui might be a bit of a problem just overall because Rui is a pretty difficult fight, but the father demon, the other demons, the demon slayer puppets are vastly easier and far easier than normal because of basically the connection and the training that both of them have had together, and also the benefits that Inosuke himself may even get from water breathing. Yes, I'm saying it, he's going to benefit from water breathing. So ironically enough, this is leaning more in favor of Inosuke. There's an argument to be made that approaching the battle of Rui, that Inosuke is stronger than Tanjiro. But that is not even saying that Tanjiro is weak, it's just saying how strong Inosuke truly is at this point. So yes, the Rui fight is a difficult one, but since he's able to defeat the other demons, it should be a 3-on-1 with Tanjiro, Nezuko, and Inosuke facing down the one and only Rui. Now, from here on out, this is where we see massive benefits with Tanjiro, Inosuke, and Zenitsu as, well, usual, because when we talk about actually training and the rehabilitation and all of that training, all of these things will benefit them massively. But since they're already at a higher skill level and already benefited massively from training together and training with Urokodaki, then we're actually talking about a stronger version of Tanjiro, Inosuke, and arguably Zenitsu because of them two being further along, even though Zenitsu would fall behind quite a bit because he unfortunately isn't at the same level as them from the quote-unquote start of their meeting. But still, he would be a little bit stronger than normal because of the kind of the height that he has to get to somehow keep up. Now, this would lead us to the Mugen train, and in this version, Akaza does show up. So the question is, can this version, Inosuke, Tanjiro, and Rengoku defeat this version of Akaza? And I'm not gonna lie, there's a good chance that they give him a run for his money, because I truly believe that with Inosuke actually getting proper training earlier on, and also Tanjiro benefiting from the training with Inosuke, having a partner for those more or less like 18 months or 2 years that he trained, I mean, this is massive leaps and bounds above what they normally are at this point. So they're not going to be useless bags of sand, basically, when facing down Akaza. They're actually going to be useful when facing down Akaza. So there's a good chance that, at least bare minimum, Rengoku can actually survive this fight. And there's a chance that they might even be able to defeat Akaza. But I will say that is a pretty hard task because none of them really know how to utilize the act or the ability of more or less hiding your killing intent. So I could see Akaza somehow surviving, but a 3-on-1 with far more stronger version of Tanjiro and Inosuke would be a hard feat for Akaza to take down. But for now, I would say Rengoku lives and Akaza more or less survives just barely and is able to escape. Now, this would lead us to the Entertainment District arc, and as I normally get to these points, Entertainment District arc is a kind of a breeze, especially if you have a Tanjiro and Inosuke who scale up relatively well with the third, or I guess technically fourth, strongest demon if you want to count Muzan, but third in terms of Upper Moon, so he's Upper Moon 3. So if he's able to keep up with them, there's a good chance that Inosuke could more or less solo Daki. And the fact is, Tanjiro can take down Gyutaro with Tengen relatively easily. So that's kind of why I believe this version of Tanjiro and Inosuke, in terms of strength and power, are actually going to be at a higher level than the previous timeline. And just to like sum it all up, I want to talk about why I feel this way, right? I truly believe it to be this way because we have a version of Inosuke, right, in this version of the timeline that could be stronger than possibly Tanjiro, depending on how serious he takes the other versions of training, learning water breathing and such. But Tanjiro would easily catch up and eventually catch up. But when you have Tanjiro actually train with Inosuke and be in the wilderness and not have any involvement with Urokodaki, there's only so much strength that they could gain throughout this time. They would have benefits just from training with each other, but it would be so simplistic, at least until they actually get proper training from some of these other people that can teach them how to properly utilize their abilities, and that includes Tanjiro, of course, learning sun breathing eventually in that version. So that's why I think the first version is probably a more balanced, quote-unquote, version. The second version is something that would be kind of unfair for the demons because of the benefits that both Inosuke and Tanjiro will get earlier on and continue to get as they progress through the series. With that said, I would love to hear what you guys have to say on the idea of what if Tanjiro and Inosuke grew up together, and how do you think it would occur in terms of how they would even end up growing up together in the first place. I would love to hear what you guys have to say, and I hope y'all enjoyed the video. As always, show some love, leave a like, leave a sub, leave a comment down below, all that good stuff, and I hope all y'all have an amazing day. Later.